Hey everyone, let's talk about game objects. Game objects are these items that you'll see in your hierarchy over here. Your main camera is a camera object, and your directional light is a light object. There are also empty objects. Those are game objects that you could use to contain other groups of game objects. 3D objects, like cubes, spheres, capsules, cylinders, and planes, for example. 2D objects like sprites, effects like particle systems and trails, audio like audio sources, video like video players, and UI like text, buttons, and panels. Right-click again on this empty space, press Create Empty. This is going to create an empty game object, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It is a game object with absolutely nothing on it, nothing in it. The only property it has in the Inspector tab is this transform component. I'm going to double click on it. It doesn't bring me anywhere. It is just an empty container that is sitting right here. All it has is a location. I am going to rename it by clicking over here where I see game object, and I am going to name it environment. And that's just because this is where I'm going to put all of my scenery. I'm going to right click on that. And by scenery, I mean like the floor, anything that's not the player, honestly, or a prop or collectible. I right clicked on environment, go to 3D object, and click cube. Now, that environment game object has a cube inside of it. So if you want to change the position of the entire game object, or even the scale or rotation, you could, and it'll scale whatever is inside of it. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. I'm going to open up that arrow again and rename my cube by this time making sure that this is selected, and then by clicking it again, and in a moment it'll highlight it, and I'm going to write floor. Then I'm going to go over here to the floors transform component, not the environment parent game object. Parent meaning it is the one that the child game object is inside of, the child game object being the floor in this instance. So make sure you're clicking on floor, and then go to its Y transform. Click right here, make sure that it is the position Y, and go to -1 on your keypad. I typed -1 and now it is a little bit lower. Go over to scale and first click on the X value and press 10 in there. Skip Y because Y is how tall our object is in Unity, and we want to make sure that we leave it the same height. I press Ctrl Z to delete that change, and then I click on the Z coordinate and I type in 10 there. Now we have a little floor. I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit because, as you can see here in my game panel, I can kind of see under it as well, and I want to make sure that our scene is what we can see. I'm going to scoot out like this using the I clicked the middle mouse button to drag myself around here, scrolled in and out to zoom in and out. Click and hold this vertical arrow pointing upwards, the green one. There. That seems good enough for me, but I do want to make it a little bit longer in this direction, going outwards from our perspective from the main camera. So I'm going to press the scale tool up here. I'm going to click it. I'm going to adjust it a little bit more to make it how I want it. I like that. I'm going to move my camera back a little bit by going back to the move tool. My scrolling backwards. There we go. I'll deselect that by clicking something else. Press Alt and the left mouse button. Click and drag. I'm going to move our directional light a little bit upwards. There we go. And then I am going to add another game object. Right click on this space outside of the environment game object. Make sure you're not selecting any of the other game objects. Right click, go to 3D object, and click sphere. And now we have a sphere in our scene. Let's talk about some of the components that come with this sphere. First, as we move into the Inspector tab, I'm going to click on that and rename it Ball. Then I am going to change its scale a little bit. Instead of 1, I'm going to make it 1.5 and see how much bigger that makes it. I like that. So I'm going to do the same to each of the other coordinates for the scale. As you can see, if I only do X and Y, let me rotate, that's a pretty flat sphere because we don't have the Z. So I'm going to add that Z. And now it's back. The next component is the mesh filter. This is the filter that decides what kind of mesh you have here. So right now it is selected on sphere. If I wanted to, I could click it and then change it to cube, and it would change that. It wouldn't change anything else. As you can see, we still have a sphere collider. I'm going to go ahead and change it to a sphere again. But that's what that component there does. I'm going to close it so that we don't have to worry about that right now. Mesh renderer is basically the component that just allows us to see the sphere. If I check this button here, you can see that the green outline of the collider, which we will talk about next, is still there because all you did was get rid of the appearance or the render of that sphere. I'm going to click this box to select it again and make it active. And then I'm going to click this drop down arrow to collapse it again so that we don't have to worry about that either, since we're not going to be messing with those. Next is our sphere collider. That is that green outline that you see that's surrounding that sphere. Right now you can see that the settings are to edit the collider manually, which you don't need to worry about that because it is perfectly aligned the sphere collider to our sphere. The material, which we don't have a physics material right now, those are things like making attaching a physical material to make the ball bouncy, to make it slippery like it's on ice, things like that. The center setting changes the offset to what the center is. I'm moving the x-axis back and forth. And you can see that it just changes where that collider starts on the x-axis. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to get rid of that change. And then radius, I can click that and press 1 instead of making it 0.5. And as you'll see, it doubled the size. The radius is just the size of half of the diameter of this sphere. It's basically if you put a point at the middle and then measured it to any of the points on the outside here, that is your radius. So I'm going to change that to 0.5. It's just a way of measuring that. This setting that says is trigger with a little checkbox, just we're going to talk about that later when we get more into programming on day 2. But for now, make sure you don't check that. Make sure that that is unchecked, because that is going to change your sphere collider to a trigger, and that's going to make it lose its behavior as a collider the way we're using it in this tutorial here. So for now, let's move on. Press Ctrl S to save your scene. Now, let's click on our cube down here. You'll notice that if we look in its inspector, it has the same kind of components as the sphere. It has a transform component that just tells how it's scaled and what it is, a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, and this time a box collider instead of a sphere collider, because we're working with a cube instead of a sphere. It has all of the same settings aside from size, because it is not based off of radius anymore. It is just based off of the different coordinates, x, y, and z, because we can't scale a cube using radius. Let's go ahead and play our scene as is. To play your scene, go up to this play button and press it. Nothing happens, and that's because we do not have any physics in our scene so far. Press the button again to stop that. To add physics to our scene, we're going to add a rigid body to our ball. To do that, go over to our inspector and press Add Component. Type in rigid, and as you're doing that, you should see in the suggested search rigid body and rigid body 2D. Since we are working in 3D, go ahead and click rigid body to add a rigid body component. Now let's see what happens. Go ahead and press play again. Now you'll see that we have gravity and physics in our scene. Our sphere has something that it didn't have before. It had mass, and it had gravity. Let's press that play button again to stop our scene. Now I'm going to show you what happens if our sphere did not have a collider. Let's uncheck this little box by our sphere collider, and that's going to deactivate it. Now let's press play again. As you see, we are falling, and that's because we have no kind of collision detection in the scene, and that is what that collider does. It allows us to catch this ball. It gives it some kind of collision. So let's go ahead and check that box next to sphere collider again. I'll press play once more, and you'll see that it is back to landing on the surface. Press play again. I'm going to show you what happens if our floor didn't have a collider. Let's uncheck this box next to box collider and press play. So you see, the same thing happened, and that's because there is nothing to catch that sphere. There's no collider. It's okay if both of them have a collider, because then they would both interact with each other. But since only one of them at a time had a collider in both of those instances, it would just pass through one another. Make sure that you check that box to activate your box collider again. There you go. Now I'm going to add a ramp. Right-click on your environment empty game object, create 3D object, and click cube. Make sure that when you scale this new cube, you are not clicked on the parent object, which is the environment object, because let me show you what happens if you decide to scale by this object here. See, it is going to affect everything under it, and you don't want that to happen because our environment game object is meant to be a container, so that if we needed to scale or move the entire environment as one object, then we could. But if you are going to start scaling it by the parent object, that is when things might start getting skewed. So be very intentional about that if you're going to try to do it that way. But in this instance, please make sure that you are not pressing the environment game object, which is this right here. Make sure that you just have this cube selected. I'm going to press up here to highlight the cube text, and I'm going to name it ramp and press enter. Then I am going to press this little X on this little compass here, like that. Press the middle button and drag myself up. Then I am going to click this square. There we go. As you can see, it made my my 2D, there we go. It makes your, I was inside of the ground there, so I wasn't able to see the ground, but when you zoom out, you can see it better. The only reason why I have it in this perspective right now is because it'll be easier for me to orient this cube. I can see it both in the game view down here and in this view. So I want to skew it a little bit more. Actually, we're not going to do it that way. I wasn't going to click on anything on the screen, by the way. You can't. You can try to, but it will not do anything. You can only manipulate your scene up here in the scene view. Alright. I am going to turn our cube by 45 degrees on the x-axis, and then I'm going to scale it up by 5, 5, 5, and then I'm going to move my game object so that only this top part, this top triangle part of the new diamond cube shape I've made is on the surface. So if I look at it from another perspective, I'm going to click the middle circle there. I'm going to hold Alt and left click and drag. I'm going to scooch this a little bit using the bottom game view as a helpful guide to where I want it to be. And now, the lighting is the reason why the shadow is so dark. I'm going to take this directional light. I'm actually going to rotate it a little bit, like that. And then I am going to use this blue arrow to drag it out a little bit. There we go. That's a little better. You'll have more time to play with those settings, but for now, I am going to press this scale tool and adjust it however else I want. I'm going to make it a pretty steep ramp. And then I'm going to rotate it just a tiny bit. Here is our ramp, and now I am going to click on our ball, this time from the hierarchy. Click the move tool from up here to the top left and drag it up some more. I'm going to drag it off screen. As you can see, if you keep moving, your mouse cursor will actually leave the top of your screen and enter the bottom of your screen, which is pretty cool. We can see the shadow. Alright, now let's go ahead and press play. That's pretty fun, right? So that's what we mean by a physics test. That is you testing your rigid body and just seeing how it reacts. Now, I'm going to show you how to make a physics material. So go over to your project area over here. Make sure that you are in this blank area inside of your assets folder with this assets folder tab selected. Right click here. Create a physics material right down here, and then name it bouncy ball. We are going to attach it to our ball by clicking and dragging and attaching it here. We know that it is there by clicking and seeing that in our sphere collider under material it now says bouncy ball. Let's click from the assets folder again, the bouncy ball physics material. Go over to bounciness and drag it to 1. And let's press play again. Now we have a bounce as we drop off. Make sure that you aren't doing any changes while you have the play button selected. If you are playing your scene, any changes that you create are going to be reversed back to the way they were from before you pressed play. So just please keep in mind that you are ending your play session. You are pressing this button and making sure that it is not selected anymore. Right now it is playing. And then I press the button again to make sure that the blue goes away and that I am not still playing. I thought I already named this ramp, but I suppose I didn't. maybe I forgot to press enter afterwards, which is a common mistake. I am going to go over here to where it says cube, click on it to highlight, and then I'm going to type ramp and press enter. I might have pressed Control Z too many times as well, that could happen. Now, I know that it's called bouncy ball, but let's just go over here to material, click this little circle icon, and then click bouncy ball. Double click to exit that screen, or just press the X after you've clicked it. And now they both have that material. Let's press play. Now it bounces even farther. It doesn't even touch the ground again. Now I would like to show you what our gravity setting on our rigid body does. It's obvious that it creates gravity and is the reason why we are able to drop. If I unselect this Use Gravity tab over here, this little box, if I click it and make sure that it is deselected and press play, nothing's going to happen because there's no gravity. Then I press play again so that I can change things in my scene. Check Use Gravity, and let's press play again. But this time, when I press play, I am going to let it bounce off of the ramp, and then I'm going to deselect Use Gravity while we are playing so that I can see what would happen if at that point it lost its ability to have gravity. Let's press play. Alright. Now as you can see, it's not falling down. Since it's already in motion and it has a rigid body, it is just shooting off into the air. And now I am going to check gravity again. I'm going to check Use Gravity again, and we will see what happens. My guess is it's going to plummet down into nothing again. Yep. Very good. This has been a discussion about game objects, colliders, and rigid bodies. Thank you and have a great day.